The next videos are from Mark Sargent's Expert Series. In the first video, Mark interviewed a commercial surveyor who had a 32-year career and surveyed large projects. The experienced surveyor affirmed that the curvature of the Earth was never considered or discussed, but should have been an integral part of his and others' surveying work. In the next video, Mark interviewed a 27-year USDA surveyor who affirmed the same and added that the whole idea of sea level does not work on a globe.
I got an interesting call from a surveyor, and by that I mean a land surveyor, commercial land surveyor specifically. He doesn't shoot the line of sight on homes or anything. He does commercials, commercial property, big things like car factories, airport runways, stadiums, that sort of stuff. Big tracts of land. He's basically going to say when he comes out here that he did his entire career in the Midwest, started in Indiana. And he did big tracts of land. And he's basically saying, look, the whole industry of being a commercial surveyor, everything is based on a plane. It's based on a flat model. They say when you shoot your lines and you lay out the land for the construction teams, you're basically working on a flat plane. And I thought that was intriguing. And this guy was saying that here's the problem. And he actually asked this when he was younger. And apparently this has just been passed down from generation to generation of surveyors, where they say when somebody asks, well, what about we deal with the curvature? And they go, and the saying is, oh, just don't worry about it because you're working on a flat plane, right? The project you're working on is a flat plane. Well, the problem is everybody is working on a flat plane. What they're saying is every surveyor that goes out builds his model like the ground is perfectly flat. Like you're working on a flat chessboard. But the problem is that you're working on your chessboard and you have to interlock with somebody else that's working on another project next to you, and he's working on a flat chessboard. The problem is eventually those chessboards have to butt up against each other, and the curvature has to come into play at some point, and it never does. It just everything interlocks perfectly like Legos, and in a city. So he's going. It doesn't seem like much when you're just working from one piece of property to another, but think about an entire length of city. A city from beginning to end. You can't tell me there's no curve from there's not going to be a conflict from one end of the city to the other end of the city. There's going to be feet of curve that nobody takes into account. They don't even talk about it. So you were a surveyor in the United States from 1979 until you retired in?
11. Well, 30 years, yeah. So
2009, roughly?
Well, 11.
Oh, 2011. So 32 years.
Uh-huh.
Got it. So you're surveying, United States, and you specialized in large construction surveying, not houses or anything like that. Manufacturing plants.
Sports stadiums, Eli Lilly projects, big turbines, big buildings, Toyota, mile-long car plant, Federal Express, the tarmacs at the airport. I mean, it would have been a daily joke. Oh, curvature of the Earth. Oh, made a mistake. Curvature of the Earth. Oh, we don't match each other. We don't match each other because you came off of that point and I came off of this point, and there's curvature in between. It would have happened every day.
Got it. So let's kind of delve into that a little bit because you and I were talking about this off air, which was when it comes to point, so like you're working on a project and somebody else is working on another part of the project, but everything that you've told me so far, and we'll get into it, is that surveyors work on a flat plane model.
It's called a plane survey.
A plane survey. That is your technical term for it. And so if you're working on your plane survey and another guy is working on his plane survey, well, there's a problem there if you guys end up meeting each other because technically there should be a curve if you believe that everything's curved, there should be a curve in between you two. Therefore, where your edges match up, there should be a conflict, right?
Well, exactly. And the USGS markers don't give you any limitations on how far you can project that plane.
Do you know anybody off the top of your head that actually, because remember, you're working on a planar model. Did you ever talk to anybody in your career that was actually using the geodetic model as on their project?
No.
From one city to the next, you've got a whole bunch of different surveyors working on different plane models, and these models have to link up. And where they link up, unfortunately, the distance between one end of a city to another, there should be a little bit of a curve there, and that means the models won't match up. It's like fitting two pieces of tile together, but you've got different tile workers working on it, and
they're different shapes. So,
and they're different shapes on top of it. They're not even like you're matching up a square to a square.
you don't even take into consideration curvature, and everything always works.
The surveying books basically say, you know what, you're just going to be working off a flat model. Don't worry about anything outside of your flat model because you don't know what's outside there. But everybody else that's doing their same thing, they're reading the same thing. So, okay, my flat model is hooking up to your flat model, which is hooking up to your flat model, which means it'll all work out just fine.
It does.
So the curvature is more or less just ignored because no one's ever seen it. So the textbooks say, yeah, don't worry about it. It's nothing to sweat, right?
Well, right.
Because you're working on your project and you've got, your friends are working on their projects, and when they connect, they work, nobody questions it because it works. It's like, oh yeah, well, everything looks good. Let's just keep doing what we're doing. Nobody ever questions the curvature of the earth. It's never, in fact, in the 32 years that you were doing surveying, you guys never, when you're sitting over coffee, never came up.
No.
I called you because as a retired USDA employee, I ran across your documentary, Flat Earth Blues.
Yeah.
And about 30 minutes into it, as a career surveyor in my career, that I realized that you were bringing something forward that I knew was true, and I was humbled, somewhat ashamed of myself for it never crossing my mind in all the years that I was surveying things on a level.
Nice.
And that's why I'm here. But what we did, we were a technical agency that surveyed and designed conservation practices, namely on independent landowners, namely farmers, and the government and the state government as well had cost share programs, and many of these things that we designed and built were partially paid for by the state or federal government. We had the technical authority to design them, to certify them as completed, but some of the jobs, and we had other departments. One in particular was a watershed department where we had a program to reduce flooding, and we build larger scope practices and projects, namely dams, and any dam that would impound 5 acres or more of permanent pool area. In layman's terms, that would be approximately 5 football fields with the end zones taken off.
Sure.
Or any dam that has a pool area that's 25 feet deep or greater. Those surveys, those jobs, the attitude of the employees went from trying to be speedy and efficient to very thorough and accurate. And when I watched your documentary, I thought of those jobs because those jobs had to be surveyed and tied to elevation above sea level.
Got it. So can you elaborate a little bit more on here? So for those people who don't know, first of all, the USDA stands for
United States Department of Agriculture.
Perfect. And you imagine in 27 years, you probably started shooting, doing the legwork, walking out in the field and shooting land parcels.
From day one.
From day one, that's what you went, and with a spotting scope. What do you call those when you're surveying?
We called them instruments. They eventually got laser instruments later in my career, but I always liked using just a survey instrument, a level on a tripod, and we had a technician that would hold the rod, and we would survey whatever area where you're planning on constructing something, come back, and we plot it out like on an AutoCAD.
Yeah.
And then we do the hydrology based on storm frequencies, determine the geometric shape of what we're building, and provided oversight during construction, checking compaction. And when they were done, we would survey it again and certify that it met specs. And these larger jobs were also met and tied to elevation above sea level.
Well, you mentioned the thing that intrigued me was you said, hey, there's something you guys really haven't talked about, and that is sea level and
Yes.
and shooting stuff in reference to sea level. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit?
Well, the ones I shot that were tied to sea level were the larger jobs, like I mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
They had longer life expectancies, some 50 or 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
When you survey something and it's designed and built based on that survey, you want a home base. You want a certainty, an absolute. If something were to fail, something to go wrong, anybody, even after you retire or maybe you're dead and gone,
Mm-hmm.
on these 100-year practices, that you've got to have what they call a benchmark, a permanent benchmark, something that is certain.
Mm-hmm.
And not only the jobs that I've been involved in, but you look at iconic man-made structures. I looked up Hoover Dam. Anybody can do this, and it's tied to elevation above sea level, because when you think of it, when you have to come up with something that's going to be left untouched, undisturbed through the life of this practice, 100 years maybe or
Mm-hmm.
more.
Yeah.
But what better to use than the elevation of the sea? Not to mention, and I can only speak for in the state of Missouri, and I can say this with certainty because I've seen them with my own two eyes, and I've used them to do my job.
Mm-hmm.
In the state of Missouri, the old timers told me they were placed like back in the 40s. We just arbitrarily throughout the state in rural areas, there are these concrete discs. They're flat. They lay on the surface of the ground.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost as they have a stem to keep them in place, but I can't assert to that for sure. But and it's 2.5 diameter concrete disc, and embedded in the very middle is a steel plate that's engraved. And don't quote me on this, but it would say something to the effect USGS Geological Survey certified.
Yeah.
728 feet above sea level.
Yeah.
And the number would be real big.
Yep.
So on these big jobs, we would start and finish our survey. It's called closing your circuit. You'd start on that known certainty, and then you would conduct your survey. Some of these surveys would take days, and then we'd close our circuit, and we'd have to be within 1/10 of a foot accurate.
Wow. So just barely over an inch.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. And these markers, yeah, and I'd heard about this, that the other surveyor said the same thing, which was, he said that these markers, no one had ever seen one ever get placed, but they were just part of this book, this USGS book, that these markers, you may have to use them depending on what you're building, but they would be around here and there, and they were part of. In fact, he thought it was quite a revelation that. These were the guys that put this down, the same guys that I mentioned in the clues that were tied to the azimuthal equidistant map, and they were the ones that used that, and also tied to the UN flag. Not to say the USGS is part of this giant conspiracy to hide what we know as the shape of the world, but it is interesting that they are the map makers, and they are the ones that lay out. I mean, they're basically keeping the whole thing going.
They certainly are, and a lot of agencies and even private sector work off. I think of topography maps. We use those a lot,
yeah.
And they were based on elevation above sea level, where lines increments of 5 feet in elevation. You can just look at a topography map and tell if it's steep or flat.
Yeah.
And they always are. They have numbers, and those numbers on those lines would represent elevation above sea level. And if we're living on a ball that's 25,000 miles in circumference, elevation of sea level really doesn't mean anything.
Next, we're going to hear from an air traffic controller interviewed by Mark Sargent. This air traffic controller said that he could see aircraft on radar up to 350 miles away. These aircraft should have been many miles below the curvature of the Earth and invisible to radar.
Across the Jonathan Walter, and he's talking about how he can fly an aircraft for 100 miles, and he doesn't have to adjust anything on his aircraft, and he can just fly straight and level. And all of a sudden it dawned on me, oh my God, I was an air traffic controller. I have the hardcore proof. I mean, forget this laser beam test. I'm watching, airport surveillance radar At aircraft 350 miles away, I'm receiving a radar blimp. I can see their altimeter. I can see the airspeed. I can see everything. And so I was bored one night, and the facility manager said, "Hey, why don't you set that scope and set out to 350 miles?" And I'm scratching my head going, "What? The radar goes to 350 miles? You've got to be kidding me." There's limited range to radar.
Yeah.
And we were told that to overcome this range is the E-2 Hawkeye aircraft that would fly and extend the range of the radar back to the aircraft carrier.
Sure.
Never once were we told about anything about curvature of the Earth.
Yeah.
Not once.
No. Why would no? Yeah. Nobody else has been told that either. Apparently.
No, it was not part of my training. So I set up. I was perplexed. Set my scope at 350 miles, and sure enough, I could see aircraft at 350 miles away, no problem. And I started. We weren't talking about. I didn't know anything about the curved Earth. I didn't know about the equation. And I started pulling out my calculator, and I'm like, okay, at just 300 miles away, which was a clear radar blimp, at 350, they got a little fuzzy.
Yeah.
But we're talking about 81,666 feet. And aircraft don't fly that high unless, classified mission.
Oh, of course. That. Yeah.
And I'm reading their airspeed and their altimeters, and I dialed it down. I'm watching Boston traffic and, the whole traffic pattern, because I'm interested in that kind of things and how civilians control aircraft, because it's a little bit different in the military.
Sure.
And then I'm sitting there going, well, it's impossible, according to these equations, for me to see the Boston traffic. I shouldn't have been able to see it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're following it, and forgive me if I'm giving the wrong terms. Jonathan's probably better at this than I am. So you're following them all the way into the Boston airport?
Oh, yeah. I wasn't watching their altitude and airspeed, but yeah, I'm watching them hit the ground. Clear day, cloudy day. I don't care what kind of day it was. You could have the worst weather in the world.
Yeah.
And I could see the whole eastern seaboard, no problem.
In the next video, Mark reads a letter from an Australian intelligence officer and defense engineer. This well-experienced officer stated that the satellite communications and GPS were indeed ground-based.
From 1997 through to post 9/11, I worked in signals intelligence for a branch of the Australian Defence Force called the Defence Signals Directorate. For a period of time, I was based at our prime intelligence facility, but had worked alongside U.S. intelligence officers since I began, primarily USN, United States Navy, liaison officers. Before I kick off, let me say this. One of the first things that stood out for me was pilots, navigators, and aircraft crew rarely help higher than secret clearance. Rarely help higher? Well, whatever he wrote there. The security briefings I attended and supported were levels above their need to know. And when I questioned this, I was told field assets are never given all the facts in case they are compromised, captured. Makes sense. As a result, they are heavily compartmentalized and trust that their mission profiles have been generated with all the facts and really are outside of their operational scope. So when I hear Mark talking to pilots, navigators, and even weapon system operators, this comes to mind. Anyway, post my time with Intel, I joined BAE Systems, formerly British Aerospace, as a senior hardware engineer assisting the design, development, and handover of Australia's first airborne early warning and control aircraft, otherwise known as Wedgetail. Due to my background with intelligence, BAE bent over backwards to bring me in, since one key role of the aircraft was to establish intelligence feeds for our defense analyst. One of my initial tasks was to develop a simulator, racks of equipment, which demonstrated how data feeds were pulled and disseminated within the classified intelligence centers. My past colleagues certified the suite, and I was given a chairman's award. I went on to collect one more during my time with BAE and another nomination. My role is detailed in the above profile link, which I'm not going to send you guys because it actually has his name in it. As the project began to wind down, I moved to Raytheon and joined the Air Warfare Destroyer Program, which is our country's first AEGIS destroyer. I have been with them for 7 years and initially joined as engineering lead for the very short-range defense capability. Again, see my link for a breakdown on that. Australia has a significantly smaller military than most countries, so we are very good at intelligence gathering and enhancing the engineering of our field assets to identify and reduce vulnerabilities. I have become intimately familiar with my two systems, the Mk-15 Phalanx and Mk-25 Typhoon, and part of my mandate was to find and patch weapon system vulnerabilities. The USN sail in large fleets, so they are less concerned about minor vulnerabilities in systems. We do not have the luxury, so our ship has evolved into one of the more advanced, how do you pronounce that? Aegis ships?
Yeah, Aegis. I think
Aegis.
it's Aegis, yeah.
Aegis ships on the water. My systems have been successfully integrated as of November 2015. And for the past 12 months, I have been working as a combat system field services engineer, a team of 4 for 3 $12 billion ships. My role now is to support all equipment through sea trials, which has given me unfettered access to current weapon systems, their capabilities, and a conduit to the OEMs, which has led to many interesting discussions over beers. Typhoon system, for example, has an aerospace top light camera optical system on a ground-based 25mm chain gun. Its active range is to 3 kilometers, but the top light allows you to range much further. When accepting it in Israel, I was ranging targets with the laser at 35 or higher kilometers away, nothing to account for curvature. Our ship uses GPS and a secondary only. Oh, I'm sorry, as a secondary only. For years, I have been aware that should war break out, the civilian band GPS is shut down and only military band is available. We have military controlled GPS antennas called daggers, which is DAGRS, which we use as a backup only for our weapon systems when in a war zone. It's recently come to my knowledge that shutting down civilian GPS is done through electronic warfare jamming, not shutting down satellites, which our ship is very capable of doing, as it is the Wedgetail AEW&C I worked on prior to this program, which means GPS is carried on a spectral frequency like radio waves. Our electronic warfare capabilities provide the ship with far superior position location compared to the GPS system. Observations. When I was working in the Australian Joint Intelligence Center, one of my tasks was to maintain SATCOM intelligent feeds and data links. I won't get into detail, but a few things have always stuck with me. Engineers hold higher clearance than analysts. This is because we may be exposed to higher intelligence during the process of gathering data. Logically, to better support the analysts, I was working in isolation of orders and outside my compartmentalization to establish a map of sorts for my feeds and links. This was telling me that all my data feeds were coming from ground-based sources, which I initially translated as the satellites were beaming data to classified ground installations, which were relaying the data to us. All right? The reality, though, was nothing more classified than us. We were the intelligence hub. When confronting my commanding officer about this, I was told I was operating outside of my clearance and ceased any further investigation.
Next, Mark reads an email from a corporate travel agent who said that flights simply do not make sense on a globe, and that these discrepancies are actively being changed to hide the flat Earth truth.
There we go. It's from corporate travel agents. Hello, Mark. About a month ago, my father had brought up to me some flat Earth evidence. Of course, the first thing I did was laugh, but I only laughed once as I began to listen to some evidence and it all clicked in for me. As a corporate travel agent for over 20 years, I started to remember all the times the clients inquired about the length of their flight times. There were so many cases that it did not seem to make sense, and they were looking to me for a reasonable explanation. Normally, I would agree with them that the flight time seemed longer than it should be. But then the person would automatically brush it off and put it out of their mind. So next, I immediately went to my airline system to look up flight times. I specifically looked at nonstop flights as they are easier to compare long-haul flights against each other. When I closely compared flights, my heart sank as I realized it was true. There is no reasonable explanation for all the inconsistencies. I wanted to give you a good example, but something surprising happened. I had previously checked certain city pairs, such as Sydney, Australia to Johannesburg, South Africa, versus Tokyo, Japan to Istanbul, Turkey. These cities should be similar distances apart according to the globe map model. The flight time from Australia to Africa was more than 4 hours more than the flight in the Northern Hemisphere. This supports the flat Earth model. A month ago, I checked many city pairs, and every time it was obvious that there was a huge discrepancy. The problem is that I checked again today so that I could give you some specific examples, and suddenly the flight times have changed to look more as they should on a globe Earth. They may be now using aircraft that flies faster, doubt it, for the longer hauls, and the truth is that the flights often come in now much earlier later than their planned schedule predicts. So the interesting part is that it appears they have taken the time to adjust all the flight times since they are now under the radar of the flat Earth movement. This is really interesting because it shows that they are running scared of getting caught in this big lie. Another interesting tidbit is that my ex-husband is an aerospace engineer working on NASA contracts. I have long been skeptical of the moon landing and have asked him many questions to see if he could verify anything to be true, as they say. He had no idea on this subject. His company had him working only on small parts of each project and contract at any given time, and he was not informed about the whole picture. He only concentrated on his part of the project. So it is definitely very compartmentalized there at, and I'm not supposed to mention the aerospace subcontractor, but you guys can probably take a guess. And he, of course, got angry with me for questioning any of it. Ha. So this information may not be concrete enough to change anyone's mind, but I thought you might find it interesting.
The next video is a communication from a defense intelligence agent who states that all space rockets and stations are impossible in a vacuum devoid of air and oxygen. According to this expert, combustion engines cannot work in a vacuum.
Mark, please comment on the following formulation. Since all space vehicles are powered by rocket fuel-filled combustion engines, and since NASA asserts that space is, in essence, a vacuum devoid of air and certainly devoid of oxygen, and since combustion engines can only work by burning fuel in an ambient atmosphere comprised of oxygen to support the combustion reaction, then how could any NASA space vehicle have propelled itself through the so-called vacuum of space? This includes manned and unmanned rockets, satellites, telescopes, space shuttles, and space stations. In that context, one also ponders how the Space Shuttle Columbia in 2003 could have exploded in that same asserted vacuum of space. To that, while I believe one can create a spark in a vacuum with a small supply of nitrogen and oxygen, I do not believe that a vacuum devoid of air can support a propagated explosion. Formulation. Neither propulsion by combustion nor the propagation of an explosion can occur in a vacuum devoid of air. Most important is that within the construct put forth by NASA, that the universe, which lies beyond our atmosphere, is an infinite vacuum. The associated assertion by NASA that rocket-fueled combustion engines propelled themselves through that vacuum is completely impossible. This incredible flaw in NASA's staging and choreography of astrophysics through the authority is even more fundamental than the flaw that others use to invalidate these missions, that propulsion in a vacuum cannot occur as a function of the third law of thermodynamics, an argument which is interesting, but which is completely unnecessary to consider, since more fundamentally, a rocket's combustion engine cannot even work in a vacuum. Mark, if you can invite a legitimate scientific specialist onto your show in order to have him or her confirm this formulation with hard data, then perhaps an even larger segment of the population will realize that everything NASA publishes, the photographs, data, astrophysical metrics, videos, and press releases are all completely and fundamentally phony to the core. These observations are noted in the context of the absurd notion that human beings somehow do not feel the asserted motion of the Earth spinning at over 1,000 miles an hour, while revolving at over 65,000 miles an hour, and while soaring through the vacuum at over 500,000 miles per hour. The notion is even more absurd when you realize that human beings do feel the motion of a car moving at 10 miles an hour. Regards, RG.
The next video is from a U.S. Army field artillery radar operator who said that the radar beams in the system he used had to travel out an impossible 30 miles, and that no curvature was ever taken into consideration. I also included a small video describing the same radar system. 30 miles equals 600 feet of curvature.
For me. So it's by Anonymous, and he goes into a little bit of back history, and I think it's fair, and I'm not going to edit any of it out. I'm going to read it as is, just so everybody knows, and hopefully he's listening, and I know he is. This statement is written with the intention to help people wake up to the truth that we do not live on a spinning globe circling a gigantic distant sun. I will tell you about me. At the age of 32, the year 2005, I accepted Yeshua the Christ in my heart and was transformed to a new person with a fresh new way of thinking. Immediately, inspired by the Holy Spirit, I began to understand the scriptures, which revealed a different universe as we have been taught. After reading at that time, I knew the moon missions were faked, and still it never crossed my mind the truth of the flat earth or plateau. That was the little thing you put in there. I decided to proof the universe. I knew through the words of the Bible and always found myself questioning the endless space. I understood that the God of the Bible did not intend for humans to reach the stars, more or less the firmament. The story of the Tower of Babel is clear enough proof that God will not allow humans to reach across the barrier dome. Moreover, the simple statement of, look up and praise the Lord, may be questioned the globe having skies all around. By default, I can be looking down and still look towards God's throne or his domain. Still to this moment, the flat earth never crossed my mind. Fast forwarding here to the year of 2010, the age of 37, when I joined the United States Army. Got in pretty late. My job in the electronic maintenance section is to fix and maintain the field artillery radars operational. I had 1 year of training from the history of radio waves to the radar technology of today, and through all the training, sometimes in the back of my mind was telling me something is missing here for these radars to work appropriately. This is the equivalent. This is the equipment capable of generating up to 120 kilowatts to amplify the 2.4 gigahertz frequency in order to shoot the pencil beams downrange to a maximum distance of 50 kilometers or 30 miles. By the way, the 2.4 gigahertz frequency spectrum involves the Wi-Fi and satellites communications. You can search the communication sheet on Wikipedia by typing the electromagnetic spectrum. And he sent me one of those, and it's really, really cool. I encourage anybody to look at it. It's a little hard to read because it's so jam-packed with stuff. But anyway, so I get deployed to Afghanistan, and the first day on the job, I find the operators discussing whether or not the radar could actually track anything according to the position of the geography of the area. In the middle of their conversation, I suddenly came to this absurd idea and spoke, well, I think the beams should follow the Earth's curvature in order to work at such distances, right? The look they gave me was enough for me to stay out of the conversation. Then, after thinking of the statement, I asked myself, how in the world are we actually tracking anything if the beams shoot straight, then eventually they would shoot out into space, and still no idea of the flat Earth. It wasn't until this year, 2015, that my wife started showing me the images, thank you, by the way, to Mr. Anonymous's wife, from what I think are from Rob Skiba's website. I ignored her. What, not my website? What, I'm not good enough? That's fine. That's totally fine. I ignored her for a while because I was too busy with work and the present. Also, I kind of been upset with humanity because they just won't believe there's a God or an intelligent creator. One day around the beginning of summer, while sitting in the motor pool at the radar, I decided to hear one of Rob's radio broadcasts. Wow, my brain just clicked literally. I felt it going down my spine and boom, another layer dropped from the scales on my eyes. Oh, neat. The fact that Rob used the Bible and the Book of Enoch, which I began reading years back, but stopped because it did not match our reality of the globe. Since then, I can't stop the research, and wow, now I can look up and say, yes, my God. Back to the radar. So the pencil beams start in comparison with the point of a pencil, and it widens to a cylindrical shape, which we already knew because Jaron ran into that accidentally when he was shooting that beam across the water. Anyways, the rockets or any projectile needs to break the plane that these beams create at the lowest level of the mountain peaks, which brings us to the curvature equation and the discrepancy of elevation. The beams have to travel on a flat trajectory track Anything at 30 miles out and the curvature is a 600-foot drop, there can be no accuracy. Like the other military men have stated on Mark Sargent's radio broadcast, no curvature is ever taken into consideration with any weapon. I would like to include images here, but you can search them online at Wikipedia. There is information on this radar. It is the AN-TPQ-37 radar system and the spectrum frequency chart. Signed, Anonymous.
Deployed well back from the forward edge of the battle area, the AN-TPQ-37 long-range, range-gated pulse Doppler radar system employs a phased array antenna to automatically scan the horizon many times a second, forming a 90-degree wide electronic blanket over the battlefield. Any projectile passing through this electronic blanket is automatically detected and tracked, while the search beams simultaneously continue to search the selected 90-degree sector for other projectiles.
The following video is a short letter from an aviation family who found the flat earth truth and realized that aviation supported a flat earth.
Greetings. We are a third-generation aviation family. My husband's grandfather was a general aviation pilot. His father was also a general aviation pilot. My husband has over 6,000 hours as a commercial ATP, that's A as in apple, T as in Tom, P as in pilot, and was also a flight instructor. I first stumbled onto your videos, being the wife of a pilot with 100 hours of flight time myself. I thought this issue would be easy to debunk, like the aliens. It must be all a big joke. When I realized, however, that aviation was being used to debunk the globe Earth model, I was in shock because nothing stated about the physical science of aviation could be disputed. At first, my husband laughed when I told him about the possibility of the Earth being flat. Once he started listening and studying it all, he quickly changed his tune. He began to test various aspects of the globe math and superimpose it upon the physical science of aviation, navigation, and avionics. It did not hold water. Indeed, a globe cannot hold water. I believe for us, we were able to let the globe go more quickly than others because we realized that we had indeed experienced the flat earth in aviation. It is hard to come to grips with the fact that we have had a career in the field where the truth of our Earth was in plain, P-L-A-N-E, sight, and we never saw it. Our father and grandfather did not recognize it. It speaks to the tremendous power of suggestion and indoctrination we receive in school to eliminate the truth from its very obvious nature.